Yeah, so thanks, Ian, for this introduction. I want to thank the Society for inviting me for giving me this venue to present my research. And I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to join me and to listen to me speak. Before I get started into my talk itself, I'll mention that on the screen here in the bottom, you can see my email address. So if after this is over, if there's something you wanted to mention to me or question or any comment you want to give to me, you can share it with me through my email address. The article link that Ian just posted to this article that I wrote, that he mentioned, it's not an open access journal. So if you're interested in that article and you want a copy of it, you can also email me and I'd be happy to share it with you. I also want to mention that my research on this project is supported by the Manitoba Heritage Grants Program and also by the Paul Gudmundsson Memorial Fund through the University of Iceland in collaboration with Birna Bjarnadottir. And I also lastly want to mention the website tímarit.is, which is a collaborative digital archival project between the National Library of the Faroe Islands, the National and Public Library of Greenland, and the National and University Library of Iceland, which includes a complete digitized collection of Sólskin, the newspaper that I'm going to be talking about today. So yeah, I want to acknowledge that archive for making my research possible. So to get started, before I get into the main topic of Sólskin itself, I want to provide a little bit of background information about the Icelandic language press in North America. So some of you may or may not know that roughly 16,000 migrants from Iceland, which could be around 20% of Iceland's population at the time, migrated and settled in North America between the early 1870s and 1914. This community, this Icelandic community that settled in North America, produced early newspapers such as Framfari, which ran for 3 years between 1877 and 1880, and another newspaper called Leifur, which ran between 1883 and 1886. And you might guess that this latter newspaper was named after Leif the Lucky, who was, of course, a powerful symbolic figure for the Icelandic migrant community in North America. Other major newspapers came along after these short-lived newspapers, and the two most important and lasting of these papers were the paper Heimskringla, which was established in 1886, and another paper called Lögberg, which was established in 1888. And both papers ran into the late 1950s until they amalgamated to become Lögberg Heimskringla, which happened in 1959, and that paper is still in print today out of Winnipeg, though now it is predominantly and pretty much exclusively an English language newspaper. So that was a gradual process that happened over time. And the image on the right here I have is just a few of the figures that were pivotal in the establishment of the Icelandic language press in North America, and specifically standing on the right is a man called Sigtryggur Jónasson, who was very vital to the establishment of the Icelandic press in North America. And seated on the left is another guy called Halldór Briem, who was he was also important. He was the editor of Framfari for most of its run, so not at the very beginning. There was plenty of other publishing activity within the North American Icelandic community. Books, magazines, newspapers, pamphlets, special interest periodicals, and lots of other things as well. If you do want to read more about this, including the geographical, political, and religious background of the Icelandic language press in North America, there is a really good and old article. It's from 1916 by Halldór Hermundsson, but it's one of the best English language overviews of the Icelandic press in North America. And I'll have a slide at the end of my talk with a bibliography which has that information. And Stefán Jónasson, who is the current editor of Lögberg Heimskringla, a couple months ago, he published a piece in the paper, which is also provides a lot of really valuable information about the Icelandic language press in North America. So I won't go into those full details, but suffice to say that while they were often occupied with the various hardships of daily life. Members of the Icelandic migrant community recognized early on the very crucial role of a local Icelandic language press in the efforts to maintain Icelandic culture and to promote a shared sense of Icelandic identity in the new North American context. And this was not least among the community's youngest members. So to foster those things among the younger generations. And that's where the children's newspaper Sólskin, the main topic of my research, comes in. And on the right, you can see a page from the first issue of the third volume of Sólskin from October 11th, 1917. And I chose this one because that year is when they started to include this illustrated nameplate or masthead. So it's a little bit more striking visually than some of the earlier issues, but you'll see some of those too today. So Sólskin was preceded by a few other Icelandic language children's papers or periodicals. You know, the line between those is sometimes a bit blurry. Published in North America, they included Kennarin, Börnin, Framtíðin. These were a few that ran for short periods of time between 7 and just a couple of years, you can see here. Sólskin itself, which is in English, that translates to sunshine. And you can see that represented in the masthead, I guess, here too. Sólskin was published as a part of the weekly broadsheet newspaper Lögberg, beginning in October 1915. So Lögberg, one of those major newspapers that I mentioned earlier, was the paper that carried Sólskin. And it was a couple decades or a few decades already into its run when it started to include Sólskin. Sólskin itself, it consisted mainly of short anecdotes, educational essays, poems, and stories, as well as games, puzzles, jokes, and riddles, at times accompanied by illustrations. So depending on what kind of screen you're looking at here, you can see on this copy, the front page of which I have on the side here, there's a heading of Abraham Lincoln. So this was some kind of educational essay, I guess, about the life of Abraham, a biographical essay about the life of Abraham Lincoln. Sólskin was likely more widely distributed and read than the earlier Icelandic language children's papers or periodicals. I don't necessarily have data to back that up. It's just kind of speculation, but the fact that it was carried in this major newspaper probably supports that hypothesis, I guess. And I'll point to another article here, or research by an Icelandic scholar, Dagný Kristjánsdóttir. She's written a lot about children's periodicals and newspapers in North America, or she's written a survey essay about those. So she's covered a lot of ground and talking about those earlier publications and some that came after Sólskin as well. So some of the information I'm citing here comes from her work, and I'll mention a few other things that she has written specifically, or she has some conclusions she's drawn from her research on Sólskin a little bit later too. Sólskin was overseen by an adult editor, and I'll have more on that person shortly, and included material selected or written by its editor and other adult contributors. So that was kind of the main contents were chosen and or written by adults, but it did also include material submitted by children, both original material and copied material. And I'll have more on that shortly too. Just so you can get an idea of the actual physical dimensions and physical presence of Sólskin, the newspaper, I have a couple of images here that I've mocked up. So on the left, we have the large broadsheet Lögberg. So this is the October 7, 1915 issue of Lögberg, open to pages 4 and 5. And I've taken this image from that website that I mentioned before, tímarit.is. So on page 5, on the right of the open newspaper, down in the right-hand corner, you can see there this Sólskin, this block that's separated from the rest of the paper. So that is what Sólskin looked like in the paper. And I only have page 5 here, but if you turn that over onto page 6, the same block would be matched there. And the idea is that children would clip, or their parents, depending on who could use the scissors, I guess, would clip out this block from the newspaper, and there's a line down the middle, and they would fold it over to create a miniature 4-page newspaper. And you can see that in the two smaller images to the right here, which are scaled up a little bit, just so you can see them a little bit better. But this is basically what Sólskin was. You would cut it out, fold it over, and it would be this 4-page newspaper, and you can see 2 columns of text on each page. So it really was a miniature thing that children could hold in their, presumably smaller hands that would replicate the experience of adults holding a paper. The paper underwent a significant format change in May 1918, and this was due to a kind of dispute, I guess, with postage fees. And I won't go into that, but I can talk about it more if anyone is interested later. And the paper, Sólskin, continued to be published in a new single-page or nearly full-page, single-page format, but it was no longer possible without, altering the larger paper to remove it and clip it out from Lodberg. And it continued to run in that format until September 1934. But again, my focus is just on the paper when it was this removable, smaller format that could be clipped out of Lodberg. And I can discuss more about why that is after too, if anyone's interested. Now to turn to probably the most important single figure when we talk about Sólskin, is this man, Sigurður Julius Jóhannesson, who was the editor of Sólskin. He was born near Ölfus in Iceland in 1868, and he graduated from the Latin school in Reykjavik in 1897. So as a mature student, as we would say in today's parlance, I guess. And that's a picture of him on the right. The picture itself is from around 1910, but it was printed in the October 5th, 1916 issue of Sólskin. Sigurður, or Siggi Jul, as he was often known, he worked as editor of the newspaper Dagskrá in Iceland between 1896 and 1899. During that time, he also founded the children's periodical Æskan in 1897, which I believe was the first children's periodical in Iceland, I think, but don't hold me to that at this moment. And this periodical Æskan, it's important to note that this was created with the support from the Icelandic branch of the International Organization of Good Templars. And this was an organization promoting abstinence from drugs and alcohol. And if anyone here has done any work, any research or reading on the North American Icelandic community, this organization also had a really big impact on the community here. So that's important to note. Siggi Jul, he migrated to North America in 1899, and he eventually launched the newspaper Dagskrá 2, the kind of sequel to his newspaper that he had in Iceland, which ran for a couple of years here and served as the sort of unofficial platform or mouthpiece for the Icelandic Socialist Society in Winnipeg. So these details are kind of important, even though they're not going to play a huge element in what I'm talking about here today. It is really important to just recognize the ideological foundations of Siggi Jul's thinking, his association with the Templar movement, and also with the socialist movement or socialist ideology. It was an important part and informed his work in a lot of ways. Siggi Jul, he moved to Chicago to complete medical studies, which he had first started in Iceland and continued in Winnipeg, and he graduated from those studies in Chicago in 1907. After this, he set up a medical practice in Leslie, Saskatchewan, which was an area where a lot of Icelandic migrants settled, where he lived with his wife and 2 daughters. But eventually, Siggi Jul, he returned to Winnipeg in 1914 to serve as editor of Lodberg, and he created Sólskin in 1915, as alluded to before. After just over 2 years after he created Sólskin, he was dismissed as editor of both papers in November 1917. And this was on account of his public opposition to conscription. And this is tied to a federal election that happened around this time, where a pro-conscription government was elected, and the managers and managing board of Lodberg saw, I guess they came to Sigurd and they saw that he wasn't willing to relent on his public opposition to conscription, and for that reason they saw, or they felt, that he wasn't fit to serve as editor. And I won't show it here, but in an article I'm working on, I do quote a few things from a letter he published a few weeks later in Lodberg. I guess they gave him the opportunity to say goodbye to the readers, and he mentioned there something about how staying true to his beliefs were more important to him than any job. So it's a striking piece of writing, I guess. Sigurd, he went on to do many other things, including editing other papers and other children's papers or periodicals. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into that in detail here. But Dagny, in the article I mentioned before that she has written, she talks a little bit about that. And there's a really good piece written by scholar Richard Beck just after Sigurd's death in 1956 that gives a really good biographical sketch of Sigurd that talks about a lot of that activity. And I have that source, again, mentioned in the bibliography that I'll show at the end of my talk. Now to turn within the topic of Sólskin to my specific focus, which is Sólskin letters to the editor. So letters written by children, specifically sent to the editor and published in Sólskin. So Sólskin published more than 150 letters written by children between October 1915 and April 1918, mostly during Sigurd's tenure as editor. So those last few months of that period, he was no longer editor. There were a few letters published during that time, but most of these 150 letters were written during the time that Sigurd was editor. And I think that's significant in some ways. But I'm not going to draw any specific conclusions about that at this moment yet. These letters were often accompanied by stories, poems, anecdotes, jokes, etc., as I alluded to before. So children sent these in to be published in the paper. And Sigurd himself made requests in the paper, wrote requests or printed requests in the paper for children to do this. So they were prompted to do this. But most of these accompanying material, as I alluded to as well before, were copied from previously published writings or books or newspapers, journals, things like that. My focus is on the letters themselves as what we can identify as historical ego documents. And I'm not going to go too much into that terminology right now either, but if anyone would like me to elaborate on that, I can do that later as well. These letters are, I think anyone who would read them will agree that these letters are very valuable sources on the experiences and perspectives of children within the North American Icelandic community in the early 20th century in their own words. So I think that's a key of my research too, that it's these letters are children writing contemporaneous to their childhood. Though clearly valued at the time, the fact that they were given this platform, children's perspectives and voices have largely been absent in historical scholarship on the North American Icelandic migrant community. So in a lot of the major works of history on this community, there's very few references to children's writings, for example. Dagny, again, Dagny Kristjánsdóttir's article, a survey article on children's publications, is an exception in that respect. There are a couple of other kind of exceptions too. There is the anthology My Parents, which was edited by Birna, who I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, or co-edited by Birna, based on an earlier Icelandic edition of the book that had come out. So this includes valuable insight on childhood in the North American Icelandic community during around the same time, but it's based on adult recollection. So it's people writing, mostly in the 1950s, I think, recollecting on childhood experiences. So again, it's not contemporaneous to childhood in the same way as these letters are when they were written. There's also an oral history project called the Winnipeg Icelanders, which was undertaken about 30 years ago, a little more than 30 years ago, and is archived at the Manitoba Provincial Archives. And there's a lot of information, valuable insight about childhood in that archive as well, in those interviews, those audio interviews. But again, they're mostly based on recollections of childhood experiences. And that's not to say that I'm talking about, one source being better or worse than the other. It's just that these are different kind of sources, and they're all very valuable. And I also want to mention here, because I'm not going to be quoting directly from them, but there are a couple of scholars who have influenced, I guess, my perspective on approaching these letters. And those are Robin Sneath, who has written about newspapers in the Mennonite community in North America. And some of her work is about letters as well. And another scholar, Tanya Tuuhima, is a Finnish scholar who has written about a Finnish Canadian newspaper. And she is really focused on letters written by children a lot. And again, those references, you can see them at the end if you're interested in pursuing them a bit more. And one final caveat before we start actually getting into the letters. So I talk about these being, valuable sources and written in their own words. I do at the same time have to acknowledge the invisible and sometimes visible hand of the editor who oversaw the publication of all these letters, and who was sometimes asked explicitly by letter writers to correct any mistakes he might find in the letters. So again, these are not handwritten letters. These are letters that were published. So they did go through this editorial machine, I guess, to actually get to print. So I do have to acknowledge that. Another thing I should also acknowledge is that parents, older siblings, or other adults evidently, in a few cases, either aided letter writers, or in, I think, a couple of cases, at least one case specifically, it's said that an adult wrote this letter on behalf of a child. So even though I talk about all these letters being in their own words, there are a couple of caveats involved. But I still think that we can characterize these letters as being based on children's experiences and perspectives during their childhood, contemporaneous to them being children. And if because some of the letters specifically do mention an adult being involved, I think when that's not mentioned, we can, at least we can hold, in our minds that these were, authentic in some respect. Before I start talking about examples from the letters themselves, I thought it would be helpful to show a map too, and finally to get a color image here. When you're working with newspaper sources, things can get a little bit bland with monochrome images. So at least there's a little bit of color in this image. So this is a map showing the geographic distribution of the Sólskin letters during this time period across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, North Dakota, Montana, Washington, and also Iceland up in the upper right-hand corner here. So on this map, one red dot simply means at least one letter was sent from that place, or at least that post office. Some of the children living in rural areas, their letters are addressed as from this post office. So that means that they lived in the vicinity of that place, not necessarily exactly where that dot in that post office is. Many locations, especially in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, yielded multiple letters from different writers. And some children, for example, 2 siblings in southern BC, wrote multiple letters to the paper. So again, that weight is not represented on this map. So for example, in Winnipeg, there are many letters, but that gets the same red dot as Smith Island, which is the furthest area west represented on this map. The 2 letters from Iceland, I'll note, but I won't really say much about it, were written by a teenage Halldór Laxness, who some of you might know was later a Nobel Prize-winning writer from Iceland. He went under the name H. Guðjónsson in his letters that were published in Sólskin, again, when he was a teenager, so before he had ever started his career as a novelist. Again, I'm not going to say much about that, but if people want to ask more about that or discuss it a little bit more later, I'd be happy to do that. For some context, since at least some of the people listening to this are in the UK and maybe some people elsewhere too might not have a grasp on Canadian geography, I calculated last night the straight line distance from Piney, which is the furthest dot east on this map, and Smith Island, which is the furthest dot west. So that's just under 2.5 times the length of Great Britain. So from Land's End near Cornwall to John O'Groats in the top of Scotland. So that's the kind of geographical area we're talking about here. So it is a pretty vast geography. So now for the remainder of my talk, I'll turn to the letters themselves, and we'll use just a few representative examples to illustrate some ways the recurring and frequently overlapping themes of identity, culture, and community occur or appear within the Sólskin letters. So one recurring thing that we see in the Sólskin letters is this term, the sunshine children. So the letter writers frequently reference the term Sólskinsbörn, in Icelandic, sunshine children, and express a desire to be a part of this group. So here's an example from a letter written by Johanna Franklin Johnson, 7 years old, from Víðir, Manitoba. She writes, "Dear Mr. Editor of Sólskin, I enjoy Sólskin and want to be a sunshine child. The first thing I do when the paper comes is read Sólskin. With best wishes to the editor of Sólskin and all the sunshine children, Sólskinsbörn." So this term obviously relates back to the title of the paper itself. This label, Sólskinsbörn, sunshine child, was first suggested by a regular adult contributor to the paper. However, it was quickly and widely embraced by the letter writers themselves. And I think we can conclude that this really gives them this sense of belonging and identity, writing into the paper and becoming a part of this group and having this label by which they can identify as belonging to. The Icelandic language, this is obviously a fundamental part of Sólskin and the North American Icelandic press at large, as mentioned near the beginning of my talk. The Icelandic language itself was seen as both a fundamental element of Icelandic identity and crucial to preserving Icelandic culture in the North American context, both for adults and perhaps especially for children. The idea of adults being concerned about children learning the Icelandic language and maintaining the Icelandic language. But as we'll see in a moment, also children, that concern being conveyed to children themselves. But here, with this letter, we see the topic of Icelandic language learning coming in, and there are many, many examples like this. So this letter from S.O. Gislason from Hayland, Manitoba, who writes, "Dear editor of Sólskin, thank you sincerely for Sólskin. I'm collecting it together and would like to have it bound in a book. My mother is teaching me to read Icelandic so I can read the Icelandic sagas when I grow up." So many letter writers, like this letter writer, commented on the Icelandic language. Many of them talked about attending English schools, and one on attending a French school. And like this writer, they describe how they learned Icelandic from their parents, grandparents, sometimes their siblings, or at Sunday school. And they often, or sometimes, I guess, mention explicitly how helpful Sólskin is in helping them to learn to read Icelandic. So the editor must have been very pleased to see letters like that. As I just alluded to, Icelandic language proficiency could also be a common source of anxiety or guilt for many children. And there are a lot of letters similar to this one, or this excerpt from a very long letter, written by Martha Violet Goodlakeson from Claremont, Alberta. She writes, again, in what's actually a really long letter, a really interesting letter. She finishes by saying, "I think I'll stop this nonsense now. I am so scared that it isn't done well enough for you, dear editor, to put it in our Sólskin paper. but I want to ask you to please fix for me that which is written incorrectly. So again, there are numerous other examples of children expressing a similar lack of confidence in their language or writing skills, some even more kind of bluntly than in this letter. One writer even asked the editor not to print her letter in the paper because it is so flawed, as she writes, which the editor obviously ignored. Though I should say that he put in a little editor's note saying something about, this is a really great letter. So maybe that softened the blow a bit from this violation, this editorial violation, but who knows? So this is a really important theme in these letters, and this is something that Dagny Kristjánsdóttir, in her article, she really focused very heavily on this theme, the idea of North American Icelandic children's sense of anxiety or guilt over their language proficiency as a common issue in children's papers and periodicals, especially when children were writing themselves. And this is also a characteristic feature of migrant and diaspora communities, the world over, especially from minority language groups who find themselves in an environment surrounded by a dominant language. So that's something that we see recurring through these letters. Migration experiences are also a really interesting, perhaps a bit less common, but stories about migration from both Iceland and within North America feature in some of the longest and some of the most evocative letters printed in Sólskin. And this is going to be a bit of a longer letter, but I'm going to read the whole thing because I really do think it's worth it. So this letter begins, "Dear editor of Sólskin, I am glad to be able to tell a little story about myself. And it goes like this. My dear mom went to America when I was 6 years old. She found a home for me in Reykjavik in Iceland and brought me there and asked that I be well looked after. It was May 9th, 1912, when my mom and my sister Maria set off for America on the mail ship Botnia. My sister and I, who was still in Reykjavik, followed our mom on board, and I will always remember when I came back ashore and watched the ship as it carried my mom away. The woman that I had to stay with took me home with her, and I stayed with her for 1 year. I remember I looked so forward to when the year had passed to set off to my mom, who had now arrived in Winnipeg. I wasn't anxious at all. I set off with 4 people that I had never seen before. But that 1 year that I was lonely in Reykjavik, I will always remember. I often cried then and went out into the field and lay there on the grass and had my hat under my head and prayed to God that I could go to her, my mom. Once when I had prayed to him so hard before I went to sleep that my mom could send me the fare so I could go to her, I remember that the next morning a ticket came from my mom, and so onward I set off from Reykjavik. On the way to England, a man came up to me whom I didn't know and asked me where I was going. I told him. And then he asked me whether I wasn't scared to go so far on my own. But I told him that I was not, since I knew that God was with me. My mom had told me that, and I knew that she would never lie to me. So this letter was sent from Tyrfingur Hansen from Selkirk, Manitoba. And I don't think I mentioned this before, but all of these are in my own translation from the original Icelandic. So stories, moving, touching stories like this, detailed stories, evocative stories, must have resonated with many of Sólskin's readers' own experiences or with stories they may have heard from their parents, grandparents, or friends, or other people in the community. Such stories likely reminded readers, not that they necessarily needed reminding, but would have reminded them of the fact that their status as migrants or members of recent migrant families continue to be a key element of their shared North American Icelandic culture and identity. And there are some other really striking ones, but I think that one really stands out as especially emotive, I guess we could say. The events of daily life are also another common topic we see in some of these letters. Children living in both rural and urban settings also frequently shared stories about the unusual, or about the usual, and sometimes unusual events of day-to-day life. So this rural and urban thing I think is quite important, but again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into that too deeply here. But I will read this excerpt, which again is quite long, but I think it's worth all the details to read it out, so I will do that. I'm starting kind of in situ for this letter. We all know that the first month of the year, January, was terribly frosty. For a few days that month, my father was gone away, so my older brother and I had to do the outdoor work. Inside the fence around our barn, there was both a haystack and a stack of unthreshed oats used as fodder for the horses. The first day when we came out to feed the horses, the stack of oats was covered with small snow buntings, which were picking at the oat seeds with their little mouths. We finished our work and were heading for home, but then we saw one little bird lying dead on the stack, and my brother and I were afraid that one of our pitchforks had hit him. I took the little dead bird into the house to show him to my mom and sisters. Mom gave me a severe scolding for killing the innocent little bird, who had been searching for food in the cold and the snow. My sister took the bird and prepared him as if he were alive, then made a nest in a beautiful little basket and set him there, placing the basket high up in the house to dry it off, and so that nothing could reach it. A little later, 3 neighboring children came to visit us, and they were shown the little bird in the basket. But carelessly, the basket with him inside was set on a bookcase, and not in the same place as before. The next morning, when we woke up, the basket lay overturned on the floor with little feathers here and there. Our cat, who had been allowed to stay indoors during the night due to the cold, had used the night shift to rip apart the little bird's body, though it was hardly any food for him. I was furious with the cat, but it was in vain. I felt that my brother and I were the original cause of all this misfortune. So this letter was sent from H.M. Stanley Crawford, 11 years old, from Athabasca, Alberta, or near Athabasca, Alberta. Through stories like this, very detailed, again, very evocative, Sólskin's readers were given the opportunity to relate the lives of other children to their own experiences and to get to know one another better. So in other words, to develop a stronger feeling of community among themselves by sharing, sometimes very intimate parts of their lives with one another. Political and social issues, which, in some respects, people might not expect this to be a very significant part of letters in the children's newspapers. And, related to some of the other things, these were not necessarily as prominent, but there are some really striking letters dealing with some of the showing that the children in the North American Icelandic community were not isolated from the political and social issues that occupied adults at the time. And here's one letter that represents that from Olive Marion Chiswell, 10 years old, from Ginley, Manitoba. She writes in her letter, "If I had one wish, then I would wish that the war was over, since then my father would come back home. And if I had another wish, then I would wish that women could vote, since Mom says that then there would be no wars, and then men would stop killing each other. With best wishes to you and the Sunshine Children." So Olive's second wish, that women could vote, as some of you might know, would be granted in Manitoba just a few weeks, a couple of months after this letter of hers that she wrote, when some women in Manitoba will win the right to vote. Of course, voting rights were still restricted by racial discrimination at the time, so this is not all women getting the right to vote, just some women getting the right to vote. Numerous women in the North American Icelandic community played a prominent role in Manitoba's suffrage movement. And there's a journal, Freyja, which also played a big role in that. And Siggi Juul himself was also a very strong supporter of women's suffrage, and there were things published in Lodberg in support of this. Of course, the war that Olive mentions, that would eventually end too. But sadly, not before Olive's father, Corporal Reginald Walter Joseph Chiswell, was killed in action in the north of France on September 27th, 1918. So in the upper right-hand corner of the page, that's just a notice of his death, that he was killed in action, that I found in the Winnipeg Evening Tribune in October 19th, 1918. So, reading Olive's letter, knowing that, really makes it all the more, I guess, poignant. And really, yeah, I guess brings to the fore how children must have felt about this at the time. So in addition to these Sólskin letters, another thing that I've looked at in some of my research is retrospective views on Sólskin. That can also give an insight of the impact that this newspaper had on children as they recall it as adults. So one example of that is this piece written by Ingibjörg Elands about the newspaper Sólskin. It was first published in a Lutheran women's group journal periodical in 1954 and was later republished in Lögberg Heimskringla in 1979. And that's where the picture comes from on the right of Ingibjörg. So in her piece, which again is a bit abridged, but I'll read through the whole text, which I think is important. Here, it was called Sólskin, the little Icelandic children's paper, which we all loved wholeheartedly, and which came every week as a part of Lögberg, the big weekly. It brought gentle sunshine and warmth to countless homes. It was not big, but that was not essential. It was our own paper, written in a language we understood, on topics that were dear to us. And the letters, we must not forget the letters that children wrote weekly in Sólskin. These letters were magical, and it was not long before I was able to write for the paper. There was my letter printed in Sólskin, among all the others, just as I had written it. I even had to read the little letter over and over again. That unforgettable moment is one of the bright memories that filled my childhood. So Ingibjörg, she goes on to describe the further sense of exhilaration she felt when her letter was later praised by H. Guðjónsson, Halldór Laxness, in one of the letters he sent to Sólskin. So her exhilaration, both, I guess, as a child, but also later seeing who he would become and how he had written so positively about her letter and the style of her letter. Similar sentiments to Ingibjörg's appear in other writings and in several interviews in the Winnipeg Icelanders Oral History Project, which I alluded to before, and many of them document the lasting impression left by Sólskin and by the work of its editor, Siggi Juul, upon the readers, now as adults. So rather than summing things up in my own words, I thought maybe it was nicer to end, more suitable to end by continuing to let the children speak, and to end with this letter from Sólskin, which I feel offers a really good summation of the importance the letter writers placed on the community in print that was facilitated by the paper and by Siggi Juul, and also their awareness of their own crucial role in maintaining the community through their letters. So this is a letter from Stefan Eastal from Cloverdale, British Columbia. And he writes, "Dear Sunshine children, I am glad to see that you are growing in number, those who write to Sólskin, and I want to be in your group. I saw that my peer, Laura Skaving, wrote in the last issue, I was born on the east side of Lake Manitoba, but moved here to the west 5 years ago, and am now 8 years old. I have now started to write to the paper, and I think I enjoy it very much, and likewise enjoy reading your letters. Over time, we get to know each other through our letters, even though the distance between us is great." So thank you for listening. And here is the bibliography that I mentioned before. And on the right-hand side here, I have one source written in bold, and that's a reminder for myself, just to let you know that my English translations of the letters from Sólskin are going to be published online as a part of an open educational resources project through the University of Manitoba, something called Campus Manitoba. And hopefully they're going to be up in the next couple of weeks. So if you are really interested in these letters, that's going to be, again, an open access resource that you can consult. And I'd be happy to share the link once they're up with Ian, and he can, I guess, share it with your group if anyone is interested in having a look. So thank you again.
Thanks very much, Chris. Yes, if you let us know when that is live online, we can both share it with people who attended today, and this has been recorded, so we can also pop it up with the YouTube video so that it's there as an easy reference for people when they come to view it online. I'm sure there are questions, and if you have a question, you're welcome to either share it in the chat now, or you can raise your hand in a moment and ask it via voice. I would remind you that we're recording, so if you prefer to not have your likeness and voice appear in the recording, that you might prefer to use the chat. I had a question first, though, and sort of it almost goes right back to the beginning, but this is, Sólskin seemed to be something with quite a degree of richness, and I sort of I like that final letter that you gave us, which sort of made me think that, of course, the kids enjoying internet forums and then Twitter and blogs and essentially talking to each other, message boards is of course nothing new. What you were really describing was someone who was saying it's terribly nice to talk to other people and read what they have to say, even if it's a lot of it quite commonplace and everyday. Mm. But I wondered to what extent this reflected the newspaper culture in Iceland. Is this sort of, Iceland is obviously somewhere that is well known for its sort of oral traditions and its stories, but were there rich children's newspapers in circulation in Iceland in the early 20th century, or is this a North American experience?
Yeah, well, I briefly mentioned, I went through some of the details of Siggi Juel's life pretty quickly, because he did have a very fascinating life, and we could spend a whole 45 minutes or longer talking about that. But he was the one who started this journal Sólskin, which was a youth journal in Iceland. So he was a kind of innovator in doing it. So I guess to say that Iceland was a very it's always been a place known for quite a lot of a high degree of literacy and interest in letters and writing, I guess. But from and I should say that most of my research is focused on, or pretty much all of my research is focused on, North America. So I'm not an expert in the publication history of newspapers in Iceland, but from what I've read, Sólskin was the first of this children's journal. So it's not really an accident that Siggi Juel did this in North America. Halldór Laxness, in one of the letters that he writes, he also mentions another journal called American-Icelandic, which was another children's journal.
So it was imported innovation, essentially.
I think so. Yeah, it was kind of imported, but there were these other journals in North America that preceded Sólskin as well. But these were edited or created by Sunday school teachers. So it was kind of connected to that more than this kind of wide dissemination of.
Yeah, so kind of Sólskin is the mass marketed, the massification of the experience. Because I mean, my favorite thing you've shown us in the last 40 minutes was your sort of mock-up of the cutting out thing from the main broadsheet, so you could fold a newspaper together. I mean, that's superb. I mean, it's a classic case of actually having been thought up by someone who vaguely understood what children were like and might enjoy, because like you said, that means they have their own newspaper that fits their own little hands, and they get to be just like grown-ups.
It is.
It's very fun and frivolous.
Yeah, I think that is like a key, selling point, I guess you could call it, or it's a really attractive thing about the newspaper. It appealed to kids for that reason, that the touch of it and feel of it and the physical element of the paper was so vital.
We've got a question in the chat from Natalie Guttormson, who says this was a wonderful and interesting presentation. Thanks. What types of stories were in the paper? Folk tales, modern stories, educational stories?
We have a lot of all of those things, really. It was a big mix of a lot of things. Poetry, there was a lot of poetry, in the paper. Siggy Yule published a lot of his own writing, a lot of his own poetry in the paper. But yeah, we do have a ton of all of these different things. One of the things in the translations that I'm publishing that are going to be available online soon, I didn't translate the things that children submitted. So if they submitted writings, I just focused on the letters themselves. But I did try to find where I could, where the things that the children submitted anyway, along with their letters, where they previously appeared in print. So you do see a lot of the same books. So these readers for children, like, books that are instructional books for children learning how to read. So they ended up copying a lot of short stories or jokes out of those books and sending it in with them. So even though I'm not focusing specifically on it, the resource, I guess, it's going to be kind of an ebook. So I'll just call it a book that I'm putting out. It will have notes there for where I found these stories as a kind of indication for what children were reading in the community at the time. But it was really a widespread thing of all those things. Yeah, folk tales, stories by modern Icelandic writers, educational articles, and these educational articles kind of went, ran the gamut from. There's one that just popped into my head. There's a story about birds, or like an educational essay about different kind of birds. Yeah, it's just everything.
As is always the case. Right, I see we've got a question in the chat from Thordist. I'm going to come back to, because I see that Margaret Mackay has got her hand raised and it went up first. So I'm going to ask you to unmute, Margaret, and if you'd like to ask your question once you've unmuted.
Mm-hmm. Well,
you're live.
First of all, thank you very, very much for a wonderful presentation. I grew up in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I lived and worked in Scotland for many, many years since then. But I was at school there, primary school, in the 1950s, and in a very multicultural city and a very multicultural school. We certainly had Icelandic children or children with Icelandic ancestry in the schoolroom with us. Two things come to my mind. First is to ask whether the children in their letters ever wrote about their play or their pastimes and so on. It might be interesting to hear about those. And I had myself the experience of a children's magazine. This is one that was organized by what was called the Junior Red Cross. And I'm not sure when it started. It might even have been a post-war thing, post-Second World War thing, because I know that we had projects in school preparing packs of toiletries and things like that for children in the displaced persons camps in Europe, the DP camps as they were colloquially known. And there was quite a lot of emphasis on, children in other parts of the world. But those who belong to the Junior Red Cross, and I think most of us probably in my class did, would read the magazine that came out. And they encouraged, its editor encouraged children to send in poems and little bits of their own creative writing. And I even had a little poem published in the Junior Red Cross magazine in about 1952. But I'm really more interested in what, in the form of, leisure activities and so on you found from the letters.
Yeah, there are a few mentions of things. One that's just off the top of my head is jumping out at me, because there are about 150 something of these, so I can't keep them all in my head at once. But there is one. I can't remember the young girl's name, but she lived in Winnipeg, probably about 20 minutes from where I am right now, in the Victor and Sargent. This is an area of Winnipeg where a lot of Icelandic immigrants settled. And she talks about a surprise birthday party that her mother organized for her. She talks about how she was away. They took her out of the home. She doesn't say for what reason, but when she came back, there were all these people waiting for her. I think she said there were 17 kids and 7 grown-ups. And she talks about they had these picture books, I guess, that they were reading. And then she talks about someone had a slide projector, and she talks about how they all sat in the dark as they showed, I think she says something like about 100 pictures on this slide projector. And then she says something about how after that, they all played together. And then she says they ate sweets, and then they brought out a birthday cake that had 10 or 11 candles, I guess, depending on what her age was. And then she says something about everyone went home at 11 o'clock. So we do have these segments of daily life with play, and yeah, there are others too that I can't really think of
yes.
off the top. But the thing that you mentioned about the Red Cross, it brings up something interesting too. I'll just say it briefly. But near the end of Sólskin's, or near the end of the period that I'm looking at, the editor of Sólskin started this thing called the Bettel Fund, which was a way for children to, or an initiative for children to send in money that would go to improvements of an elderly care home that housed a lot of Icelandic immigrants. And there was a Bettel Fund that adults contributed to as well. But this was a way as well that the newspaper was used as this kind of charitable forum as well for children to take part in that. So that kind of came into my head when you mentioned the Red Cross.
Yes. Well, thank you very, very much. I'm tempted to ask if they had Vínateta at the party, but that's another. She
doesn't use that word. No.
Thanks, Margaret. Now I'm going to go. I have a triple header question, taking one I had myself, and then one question from Thordis and one from Arman in the chat. But a quick one first. Thordis also asks, do you know how many of the Sólskin papers or issues were published in total?
I don't know if I've ever actually counted that, but basically it was published every week from October 9th. The ones that the Sólskin that I'm looking at, the one you can cut out from the paper, it was published once a week from October 7th, 1915 to May, I think it was May 13th, 1918. So yeah, I can't calculate that off the top of my head, but I guess it's 1915, 16. So yeah, it's 100 and something, I guess. But it continued to be printed in this page format until 1934. So there are a lot of issues. But there were far fewer letters in the later iteration. And
it got less exciting later on.
I guess so, but it's also an element of children.
Yeah.
As time went on, not as many children being proficient in Icelandic language.
Yes, and that of course leads us very neatly to the sort of triple header here. If I may combine, and I'll start with Arman's comment or question. Hi, Arman. I remember meeting you in Vancouver, and he says. Didn't Halldór Laxness write either in Sólskin or Escan that he felt that the Sólskin children were much more erudite than their Icelandic counterparts? And that leads quite nicely to Thordis's question, which is, were the children who wrote to the newspaper immigrant children or first generation born in North America? And I was wondering, as you showed us the different letters, some were signed off from sort of, Icelandic first name, middle name, lovely patronymic last name, Icelandic through and through. And you didn't quite have someone called John Smith, but you had several people who had the most wonderfully banal and plain Anglophone names, but were writing to Sólskin. So who were these people, and were they more erudite than their Icelandic counterparts?
Well, I can't say whether that's true or not, but it is true that Halldór Laxness did say that. I mean, he was mentioned. It was it was when he mentioned the letter from Ingibjörg Elands. It was in that same context that he mentioned that children there can write much better than their Icelandic counterparts. I can't really say whether that's accurate or not, of course. because of, well, just my own understanding of Icelandic is, limited, but also, it's just a question that can't really be answered, I guess. But it is something that he did write. I'm not sure if he meant it authentically, or if he was meaning to, I guess, spur his compatriots to try harder or something like that either. But that is true. About whether the children or which children, or whether the children were immigrant children, first generation, or even second generation, maybe in some cases. I think the answer is they were all of these things. We do, of course, have these accounts like the one I mentioned, this Tyrfingur Hansen, who immigrated to North America. So obviously he was born in Iceland and migrated to North America. But it is evident too that some of the children were born in North America. But it's not something, I haven't really explored the individual identities and the individual histories of the letter writers as such. So when they don't mention it, it's not necessarily evident to me. But if, this project, I'm not sure where this project is heading, how long it has, how much fuel it has. But I know that next in May of next year, I'm supposed to be speaking at the Icelandic National League convention in Alberta. And as this project comes out, I am hoping maybe to get some to reach out or to hear from people whose relatives are writing in this, and maybe they can provide me some insight. I'm not necessarily going to be investing the time to do all the individual research on each of the letter writers myself, but I am hoping that once this project does get out there and these letters are available and people might start reading them, that they might reach out to me and maybe want to share something with me about the letter writers. One thing I'll mention too is, as you mentioned the names, for example, Ian, not the very last letter, but the letter I wrote about the little girl whose father ended up dying in the war. One thing that I didn't talk about, but it is evident from some of these letters too, is that we have mixed families, families with mixed backgrounds. So her father was I think he was born in England. I did look a little bit up about her family. So I think her father was born in England. So this name Chiswell is from his family, whereas her mother was of Icelandic descent. I don't know. Or yeah, she was born. Her mother was born in Iceland and immigrated to North America. And I think Olive, the little girl, was born in North America. But again, we do have the names are. We do have interesting things going on with names of these, and we do as well see, which has been a little bit, it's not a major issue, but I've put together an index of the letters, but sometimes when people write more than one letters, their names are spelled differently. Sometimes they're anglicized very heavily. Sometimes they use characters that are in the Icelandic language, but not in the English language. So this is a process too that people went through of changing their names, solidifying their names, using different names in different contexts, different spellings in different contexts. But that ties into this immigrant experience.
So, and which of us hasn't forgotten what our pen name is when we're in the moment? I remember a colleague saying that Karen Blixen / Isak Dinesen would repeatedly ask each time they were sent a contract what their pre-existing contractual relationship was under and what they had signed the contract in last time.
Yeah, right.
So we've all been there, clearly.
Yeah.
If there are no more pressing questions, but going once, going twice, if anyone has one, now's the time to say so. I'm not seeing anything in the chat and no hands are raised. Then I'm going to offer my thanks to Chris, and if everybody would like to join me in a round of applause for Chris's talk and his very engaging responses to our questions as well. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to seeing your letters when they are published in translation online. Please do send us the link.
I will, yes.
That is it for this evening, and there will be more SSNS virtual joy to come in due course. If you're a member, then you'll hear about it. If you're not a member, please do consider joining. But thanks again to Chris, and thanks to you all for coming. And that's the end of the show, people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.